Hi everyone, thanks for joining today for this session looking at the future of recruiting post-Brexit. Lots of really important updates in this webinar to help you understand really all of the sort of things that you need to think about for employing non-UK workers post-Brexit. So that will primarily cover some really important points for sponsors. So if you've got a current sponsor license, there'll be some good updates here for you, in particular in relation to the dreaded resident labour market test. And then if you don't have a sponsor license at the moment, but you will be obviously thinking about how you still engage with EU workers, most businesses do employ EU workers as a really important part of their workforce. We've got the updates here on what you need to do next. So we're going to start with some Q&As. Maybe you're still in lockdown, just like us, or maybe you're watching this a bit later in time. But I thought we'd start with some Q&As just to break us in gently. And then after that, Gemma's going to take us through some quite in-depth detail with some slides that will help you really understand this topic. We're really lucky to have Gemma in our team. Gemma is a business immigration specialist, but she also does employment law, so she's got that good overview of both. We advise on the full range of immigration matters, right through from getting a sponsor license to your duties, compliance, right to work checks, and then right on to, if you do have an issue, a breach issue, or just a complicated sponsorship situation. So if you do need help with a specific scenario, do let us know. But there's a lot of information that we can share today that should help to take you through the kind of bigger picture stuff that you need to know about what you need to do next post-Brexit. So turning to Gemma, I'm going to ask you a number of questions.
Absolutely.
And then we'll be moving on to the more in-depth training. So firstly, just to start with updating people on the rationale behind the government's decision to change the UK immigration system.
Yeah, I mean, I think after the country voted for the UK to leave the EU, God, many years ago now it feels like, which means that free movement's going to obviously end on the 31st of December this year. The government didn't really have an option really, but to review the current system and look where we're going to go. So the government appear to really be taking the opportunity to implement what they define as the 3 Fs. So a fairer, firmer and faster immigration system is currently kind of coming into play from next year. And that's going to mean the government has a bit more control over the UK's borders, and it does remove a lot of the administrative burden for sponsors from January.
Okay. The government's really been sort of advertising the point that we are open for business and that we're open to recruit talent from around the world. We haven't closed the door on that as a result of Brexit. I mean, what's your view on that?
I think the start of that kind of statement I agree with. The UK will be open to attracting talent from around the world, and it's going to be, from what I can read and see, a lot easier for sponsors to do this. However, I am concerned that there is going to be a gap for UK businesses, especially in relation to the more self-employed contractor type status, and also individuals that aren't skilled to the A-level equivalent, that aren't going to fall into that kind of new skilled worker system. There obviously are going to be other routes that a migrant can take, and I will talk through some of those later on in the webinar. But really the government's aim is kind of encouraging the businesses to invest in UK opportunities, and only time will tell if that's going to actually work.
Yeah, it's been really interesting, hasn't it? At this, time where I think more than ever we are really appreciating certain areas of the workforce, the jobs that people do in the front line,
Absolutely.
in the NHS, in retail, in distribution, in transport. Really important jobs, and yet those are ones that probably, there will be certain issues with being able to employ outside of people from outside the UK. So it's quite an interesting picture, I think, taking those two things together.
Yeah, definitely. And I think Karen, I was just going to say, if I don't cover a certain, aspects within this webinar that, participants that are watching think, oh, actually, I've got this specific situation. Is that covered by any type of exemption or whatever? Then do just drop us a line, because there may be something.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it is important to say that we're giving the overview, but if you are worried about the pipeline of candidates and employees in a particular area of your business, do let us know, because there might be something quite specific that would apply there. Absolutely. So when are the changes taking effect?
So most of the changes that I set out in the webinar that I'm going to talk about take effect at 9 a.m. Specifically on the 1st of December. But this is for the non-EEA nationals only. For the EEA nationals, the changes are going to take effect from the 1st of January 2021 when the free movement ends.
So a bit more time for people to prepare for that. But current sponsor license holders, probably more work to do immediately to understand what's changed.
Absolutely.
Okay. So discussing the main changes to the new skilled worker route, what is that route?
So essentially that route is replacing what the existing Tier 2 general scheme is. It's basically just got a new name with new rules.
Okay. And what's happening with the salary requirement? A lot of our clients have always had a bit of an issue with the salary requirement.
The minimum salary requirement is being lowered. So we're going from 30,000 to 25,600 a year, or the going rate, whichever is higher. However, the government are also looking to introduce tradable points so that salary can be as low as 20,480 in certain instances, but I'll cover those tradable points later on in the webinar in more detail.
Okay. Do you think that's the right level?
I still think it's a bit too high, if I'm honest. I think it's going to prevent businesses hiring into the UK a little bit. The skill level's coming down to an A-level equivalent, and I don't really know if 25,600 is kind of on par with that. Therefore, I do think that there's going to be a difficulty maybe with that going forward, but we'll have to see.
I think that's right, and it might give probably some pause for thought where you might have had roles that were just on the cusp there about whether actually to attract a wider set of candidates you do need to think about what the right salary is. So there's sort of equal pay considerations there as well, so yes. A bit of work to do there. If you're a current sponsor license holder, you'll be well aware of the resident labour market test, which has been quite a bugbear for a long time. So Gemma, is that staying in place?
Hooray! No.
That's good news.
We'll be thrilled to hear that the resident labour market test is being removed. So that really strict 28-day advertisement is no longer going to be the case, which is great. So it's actually going to reduce current processing times by about 4 weeks, really. However, I'll explain a bit more in this webinar later about kind of how it's still going to be really important for your business to follow their own recruitment processes to show the role's genuine. So whilst it's important that the resident labour market test and those kind of stringent requirements aren't in force anymore, it's still going to be important that you show some type of recruitment exercise has taken place.
And will the annual cap still continue? So for those who don't know, there's an annual cap at the moment in the UK on the applications that can be made. So even if you have a very genuine application that meets all the requirements, if there are issues with lots of applications happening at that time, you might find that you aren't granted what you need. Is that still staying in place as well?
No, so good news on that front as well, that the annual cap is being suspended. The terminology, quite important there. The government have said it's suspended, it's not removed or deleted, meaning that it could be subject to change in the future if the government see a bit of a surge in migration and want to take back a bit more control. But for the time being, from the 1st of January, there won't be an annual cap in place. So it'll be a lot more flexible for sponsors.
And we work with quite a few sponsors that use the intra-company transfer route. So that's where you have international operations and you might be moving employees around, particularly to share skills or experience. What's happening with that route? Is that staying the same?
So yeah, essentially those that are on the existing Tier 2 ICT, either long-term or graduate route, this intra-company transfer system is being replaced by that. As you say, kind of the intention really is for those established employees who are being temporarily transferred by their employer company to do a skilled role or be part of a structured graduate programme to be coming across to the UK that's got a linked company with the overseas company.
So what's the main changes that we're going to see on that?
This category isn't changing hugely, which probably some sponsors will be probably pleased to find out is the case, so they haven't got to grapple with too many changes. But the main changes are really going to be that applicants will be able to switch into this category. So that's a real huge change from within the UK, rather than having to go out of the UK and come back in. Also, the higher earnings threshold is going to be reduced. So we're currently at 120,000 for a higher earner. That's coming down quite significantly to 73,900, which will, be quite an impact for sponsors. And also the cooling off period is going to be changed to a cumulative period. So it will allow ICT holders to stay in the UK for up to 5 years in any 6-year rolling period, or that would be increased to 9 years in any 10-year rolling period if they were high earners. Okay. So that's the main changes to grapple with really on that route.
So in order to hire a skilled worker under the scheme or to use that intra-company transfer route, any UK organisation wanting to do that would need a sponsorship licence. Can you just summarise, Gemma, what that actually is in practice?
Yeah, of course. So an organisation will need a sponsorship licence, as you say, to hire or temporarily transfer an individual from outside the UK after the 1st of January next year. The licence gives the organisation certain responsibilities and duties to adhere to. Essentially, they're really the eyes and ears of the UKVI in some respects. And if the licence is awarded to that organisation, they'll be granted access to an online sponsor management system, and they'll be added to the National Register of Sponsors.
And how long does it take to apply for that sponsorship licence?
Often 2 to 3 weeks, probably, to prepare for the application and gather the supporting materials and documents. And then once the application is submitted, current processing times are around 8 to 10 weeks, I would say. However, kind of important for sponsors to be aware that very recently, only on the 12th of November this year, the government released a priority service for sponsor licence applications, meaning that organisations can pay an additional £500 to their current licence fee in order to get their licence a lot quicker. It's meant to be within 5 working days. Subject to demand, let's see.
Yeah, we'll see if that happens. But that is good news. I mean, one point of caution for anyone watching who hasn't already got a sponsor license and will be applying for one. Pulling together the right documents for this is quite onerous. So don't just think that you've got those short timescales there and it won't take you long, because the bit that takes time is making sure you've got the right documents. Certain things have to be certified in a certain way by certain people, which at the moment might be really quite challenging because of the current lockdown situation, which obviously we hope will be resolved soon. So if you're thinking of applying for a sponsorship license, start looking at that process as early as you can, I would say, because my experience is it does take time to pull together the documents that you need to prove that you are, a genuine UK business needing to use this route.
No, absolutely, Karen, absolutely.
For the organisations who are already licensed sponsors, do they need to do anything before the changes come in?
No, not officially. Those organisations that are already holding a Tier 2 sponsor licence will see their existing licence converted automatically into the new system, so they won't have to actually physically do anything. However, existing sponsors do really need to be prepared for their annual request in certificates. That generally comes by way of email reminder by the UKVI around January, February time. But the likelihood is that existing sponsors are going to want to increase their certificate allocation for the coming year. And if that's the case, they're going to need to justify why they want that increase and how their kind of workforce planning vacancies are looking for the 2021 period. So I think whilst there's nothing automatically to do, there is something to be mindful of in the coming months as to how you justify having those certificates ready.
And do you think that justification is another way for the government to exert some control on immigration numbers?
Yeah, but really through the back door in a way, rather than officially, I think. At present, sponsors who don't have any unrestricted certificates remaining on their sponsorship management system need to make an in-year request. Those requests at the moment can take up to 18 weeks to be processed. And therefore, whilst I'm aware that this is currently a thing that's under review by the government, we hope that decisions are going to be made more speedily early next year for those that do need to make any kind of in-year country applications, really.
Okay. A really common question we're getting from clients at the moment is whether EEA nationals who currently work for them, who are already in the UK, will they have a right to stay in the UK?
Yes, but not automatically, I think is the key here. So your EU, EEA and Swiss nationals who arrive in the UK by 11 o'clock on the 31st of December of this year will have the right to apply for free under the EU settlement scheme. And whilst they have to be in the country by that time, the actual deadline for them to make that application is not until the 30th of June next year. And that EUSS scheme will grant the individual either pre-settled or settled status. But I'll cover that in a bit more detail in the webinar.
Gosh, that rush to actually have to be in the UK is quite interesting when you think of it in the context of COVID and all the directions not to travel at this time.
Absolutely.
But we haven't seen any changes to that, have we? That's the rule.
I can't see that changing, no.
No, okay. What are the other new routes that the government's going to be introducing?
I think probably the main ones for businesses to be aware of are the Frontier Worker Permit. So the government are launching that on the 10th of December of this year. And that's going to be a new scheme for individuals who are actually resident in another country in the EU or EEA, but who regularly work in the UK. And this will be known as this Frontier Worker Permit scheme. And it will allow workers that are already in the UK, again by the 31st of December this year, to be able to satisfy that Frontier Worker definition and get a permit.
Thank
so
you.
That would be a really helpful one.
Yeah, it will be, yeah.
Additionally, I was going to say there's going to be a few more if that's all right.
Yes, go on.
So from the 31st of January, the government are also introducing Hong Kong British Nationals Overseas route for them and their close family members, given what's going on in Hong Kong. So I think that's something that really, I think it's not a sponsorship route. It's going to be something to allow them to live and work here. But from a right to work perspective, I think, suddenly employers are going to start to see those types of visas, and they need to be mindful that that does allow them the right to work. And then also from the summer of next year, I think sponsors need to be aware that there's going to be a new graduate route to kind of act as a bridge really between graduate studying and working, and that will enable employers to hire graduates much more quickly without having the need for sponsorship. So that's really positive.
That will be hugely helpful, won't it? Because there's such a huge number of international students studying here, some of whom definitely decide they want to stay on, and they could be very valuable to businesses. But it's always been a really sort of clunky position between them studying here and then finding that actually being able to stay and work is much more complicated than you might expect. So that's really good.
Yeah.
Okay, so I will hand to you now to go through some of the more in-depth detail of what employers need to think about. If that's okay.
Absolutely. So I'm just going to really take everybody into a bit more of a deeper dive into the UK's new points-based immigration system. And along the way, I'll be giving some of my top tips for businesses and sponsors. So bear with me a second. I just need to move the slide. So what am I going to be covering? I'm going to cover each of the topics on the slide with the main focus really spent on point 3, which is that UK new immigration points-based system. The key message is, of course, that the UK, is leaving the EU, and therefore free movement of people is going to end on the 31st of December at 11 o'clock, as we've previously mentioned. The transitional period ends on this date, and as such, the EU, EEA and Swiss nationals who could always come across here by way of free movement will no longer be able to freely move here. And likewise, UK nationals going across to those EU countries will also not have that free movement going forward. So what am I going to really be focusing on? Well, we're going to start off with that EU settlement scheme, as I mentioned in the Q&A, and how EU, EEA and Swiss nationals can secure their immigration status in the UK, provided they're resident here by the 31st of December. Then we'll come on to look at right to work checks. I've been having quite a lot of queries on this recently. There's a current temporary position due to COVID. It's important that employers are aware of that, but it's also, I'm also going to be covering what the future of that right to work check looks like. Then we'll be moving on to the UK's points-based new system, understanding what is changing under both skilled worker route and intercompany transfer route, and the requirements for business to hire under them post-January. I'll then come on to focus on those businesses that still require a sponsorship licence and how they should go about applying. And then lastly, I'll briefly just cover some of the other visa routes that are open for businesses that they need to be aware of. And then I'll just quickly conclude with answering some participant questions that have been submitted in advance that I haven't actually covered throughout the session already. So, the EUSS scheme. I'm sure that most of you listening will be familiar with this by now, but the EUSS scheme fully opened on the 29th of March 2019. When I saw that, I thought, gosh, that's such a long time ago that it opened, but that time seems to have gone past very quickly, especially with what's happened this year. But according to the Home Office figures, as at the 31st of October, they'd actually received 4.26 million applications, and of those received, 4.7 of those applications had actually been concluded. So they do seem to be working through them relatively quickly. The system was launched by the government to obviously ensure that any EU, EEA or Swiss nationals who had started living in the UK before the end of the transitional period, so the 31st of December this year, have the right to stay and work in the UK with the ability to do so indefinitely. I think it's probably important to note at this point that Irish citizens are exempt and can continue to live and work in the UK as normal, along with obviously any individuals who have indefinite leave to remain to be in the UK. So there's two types of status. There's settled and pre-settled. Now, settled status is for those who have lived in the UK for a continuous period of 5 years or more, so 5 years in a row. And they must have lived in the UK for at least 6 months in any 12-month period to qualify. Now, there are some exemptions to that, such as, for instance, compulsory military service, or if you've had one period of, say, up to 12 months out of the UK for an important reason, such as childbirth or overseas work posting or serious illness, then you can be exempt from that requirement. But otherwise, you're expected to have at least 6 months in any 12-month period. And then if it's granted to you, you can stay in the UK as long as you like, and individuals will be able to work in the UK, use the NHS for free, access public funds and travel out of the UK. I think the main thing to be mindful of with settled status is that if your workforce have settled status, it will be lost if that individual spends 5 years or more in a row outside of the UK, and that's 4 years for Swiss nationals. So how's that different to pre-settled status? Well, pre-settled status is for those individuals who don't quite yet have that 5 years continuous residence in the UK. So pre-settled status will be granted for 5 years to allow that individual to then be able to change their settled status and convert that into pre-settled status and convert that into settled status. It gives them individuals exactly the same rights. So they can still work, they can still access the NHS, travel out of the UK. The only difference with pre-settled status is that the individual will actually lose that status if they spend 2 years or more in a row outside of the UK. And so I think individuals with pre-settled status just need to be mindful that if they want to convert them into the settled status later on, they obviously need to then hit that 5-year recruitment residence so that they have the 6 months within the 12-month period. So that's just something to be mindful of, really. I've received loads of feedback from clients and individuals on the EUSS, and I have to say everything's really positive. It appears to be very straightforward, very easy to do online. Obviously, it's free and no cost. And whilst at the beginning there were some issues with regards to kind of the uploading of documents and things like that, that seems to have all been resolved now, and you can quite easily download on pretty much most devices the document check app to allow the individual to scan in their documents rather than send them by post. And I've seen decisions on the EUSS scheme, confirmed as quickly as 5 working days. They allow up to a month, but I certainly think they seem to be quite quick at the moment on that. Individuals will be sent a letter to confirm whether they've been granted pre-settled or settled status. However, that won't actually prove their status as such. This will still be verified online by providing the employer with the specific share code. So the applications under the EUSS, as we mentioned in the Q&A, must be made by the 30th of June next year. There is scope to apply after that date based on there being a delay for reasonable grounds, but we're awaiting further guidance on exactly what that means. So my top tip really for businesses here is that you should be encouraging your EEA workforce to make those applications as soon as possible, and certainly by the deadline. Employers can't insist on their workforce confirming their EUSS status at the present time until after the 30th of June next year. Most clients I've spoken to who are asking for that information is very much on a voluntary basis at this time, and I really must stress that. I don't see a problem with the voluntary approach as long as the individual does have a genuine choice to not provide that information, because there is no mandatory obligation on you at the moment to have that. So moving on to right to work checks. It's important that whilst the standard right to work checks using obviously original documents and taking copies is still valid and should definitely be used in the first instance if possible, there is a temporary alternative to right to work checks due to the COVID pandemic that's hit us all this year. And it's important that I just wanted to bring that to businesses' attention in case you weren't aware, because it does very much give some more flexibility to you when you're hiring in this current time. So to make it easier for employers hiring new staff during COVID, they have adjusted the right to work checks to allow the applicant to email their right to work documentation across to their prospective employer and then have a video call with their prospective employer. And essentially you'll have a situation where you're all holding up documents to the camera and checking things and verifying it. But that is allowed. And my top tip here is that if you are in that situation where you're using the temporary adjusted right to work checks, you take a screenshot of that right to work check as you're doing it, and you literally just press screenshot on your keyboard and insert that in their personnel file as well to show that you did that. Of course, EEA nationals who already have obtained pre-settled or settled status may prefer to give you their share code to check online via the online right to work system, which is absolutely fine, provided they've given you permission to do so. But of course, there is no obligation on that EEA national to share that status with you as a prospective employer until after the 30th of June. So just be mindful of that. For those of you that have undertaken the adjusted right to work check, please be aware that there is a retrospective follow-up check to be done. And that means obviously then you have to revert back to seeing the original and taking the copy. Those retrospective checks must take place within 8 weeks of the temporary checks coming to an end. My best guess probably at this time is that temporary checks are going to be in place at least until March, with furlough being extended. So I think, there's likely to still be quite a lot of scope for you to do those follow-up checks. But my top tip is that if you're watching this after lockdown, or even watching it currently in lockdown, and you're hopefully expecting to come out on the 2nd of December, then you can complete those retrospective checks whenever. So you don't need to wait for the government to say, okay, those temporary checks are removed now, we go back and trigger that 8-week period. If it's something you can get off your desk now, then absolutely do it. If it means that you are seeing new hires in the office when lockdown ends, then ensure that both those checks are kept on the personnel file is the best way. So what's it going to look like going forward? Well, the government have confirmed that up to the 30th of June next year, right to work checks will continue as normal. And so I know most of you will then be thinking, well, come on, Gemma, how's that going to work with hiring EEA nationals between January and June? The government is saying that you can continue to use their passport or their ID card as evidence of right to work. But of course, if you, as a prospective employer, have knowledge that the individual has entered the UK to reside after the 1st of January, then the sponsorship route and the new immigration system must be followed. And so knowledge is going to be the really tricky area here. How will you know that an individual's arrived in the UK to reside post-January or before without asking? And in my view, with my employment knowledge as well, to ask does give rise to a potential racial discrimination risk, as you're requiring information from an individual that isn't legally required. All that's legally required is a passport or an ID card. Now, we hope that more clarity is going to be provided in the right to work guidance, which is to be updated and due anytime. But for now, my recommendation is that employers continue to use passports and ID cards for their EEA national hires, and signpost, obviously, the EU settlement scheme to those new hires, pointing out that if they're not eligible under that route, they will need permission under the visa route, and put the onus essentially on the individual to contact the employer if that permission is needed. But of course, if you have knowledge, because, for instance, you've had one of those, temporary right to work check video calls where you're, checking documents, and it comes up in conversation that they're currently at home in Germany or whatever's happening, and it's clear that they haven't resided in the UK, you have knowledge, and therefore I think you must follow the sponsorship route. It wouldn't be permissible for you to then just take that passport, because you would be exposing the organisation to a risk of a civil penalty. So whilst you're not manually or formally asking, I think you need to be mindful that you might have had that knowledge through kind of informal means by knowing where they were located. And so just be mindful of that. But it's going to be an interesting 6-month period, I think, there as to how that's going to work. And we do, as immigration practitioners and speaking to others, we are intrigued to know what that right to work guidance is going to look like as soon as it comes out. Oh, sorry, went on a bit quickly there. So the UK's new points-based system. So moving on to the main focus really of today's webinar. I thought it was important to spend just a couple of minutes highlighting the overarching principles for the UK's new system before we kind of launch into the detail. So the core message is that obviously this is a global system. So all newly arriving non-British nationals are going to be subject to the UK's new immigration system from January of 2021. Now, I've used this picture to illustrate that businesses need to go essentially back to the starting line a bit with their recruitment. You're going to need to understand the eligibility conditions and responsibilities as a sponsor if you're going to be holding a licence before you really get involved in that recruitment race going forward. There are substantial changes which for current sponsors essentially is going to just make recruitment from overseas a lot easier. But for those businesses that are going to be new to this scheme and this approach, there is quite a lot to get your head around. And I think you just need to be aware of that because as soon as you apply for that license and it's granted, you're going to have, duties and responsibilities on you, and you need to know what those are. Now, the old system was much more academically focused, whereas the new system focuses far more on skills, from what I can read. And there is also a push going forward to move away from hard copy documents. So I think going forward, we're not going to see the, here you go, here's my visa, here's my permit. Instead, it's going to be a lot more of uploading documents for sponsors to prove things and having e-visas from migrants. So I think watch this space on that one. I think one of the key areas is that the new system will not be applicable to everyone. So whilst the door is open to the UK, businesses who rely heavily on the more kind of like low-skilled labour, as me and Karen were discussing earlier, I think recruitment into the next year in 2021 is going to look very different. There's going to be a real shift in approach to recruiting from within the UK for those roles, and a real focus on growing skills internally and training and being seen as an attractive employer, as I think competition for talent is likely to be more fierce. And I think those are things that employers are going to have to be mindful of and really start thinking about in order to try and attract the best people. In my view, there will unfortunately be high numbers of people out of work as well due to the pandemic early next year, and numerous businesses will not be looking at hiring in early 2021. Therefore, the real test of the system and its weaknesses will likely only really be visible in the latter part of next year. So it'll be interesting to see how it kind of plays out, really. So the key changes, let's discuss these in a bit more detail. So the maintenance increase. Individuals currently have to evidence that they have a certain level of maintenance, and by that I mean personal savings, to be able to support themselves on arrival in the UK. The maintenance level is being increased under the new system. So we're currently at a maintenance level of £945, but this is growing up to £1,270. However, it's important to note here that sponsors can certify this maintenance level for the migrant on their certificate of sponsorship. And this would mean that the individual then doesn't have to prove this because the sponsor is certifying this or guaranteeing this. In my experience, it's really common actually for sponsors to certify this for migrants on their certificate. And it essentially allows the migrant to then kind of be covered for their first month if they need it before they get their first pay packet. And there's also going to be a reduced skills threshold. We mentioned this slightly in the Q&A, but the minimum skill level is being lowered from what is currently a graduate or a degree occupation, which is RQF level 6, to an RQF level 3, so an A-level equivalent or Scottish Highers. Now, the full list of qualifying occupations has been published in the recent statement of changes in the immigration rules. And for those of you that are currently existing sponsors, especially page 255 onwards, confirm those roles that are eligible, and helpfully page 314 onwards list those jobs that are not going to be eligible, so those that don't reach the A-level equivalent of RQF level 3. There's also going to be a reduced minimum salary, as we've mentioned in brief passing already. So the general salary threshold is being lowered from 30,000 to the 25,600 a year. And the migrant must be paid this threshold or the going rate for the occupation, whichever is higher. The role will then need to be assigned to a job code, which is known as a SOC code, which each have their own minimum salary requirements. And where that SOC code is actually higher than the general minimum threshold, the sponsor must pay that higher salary. So for instance, the going rate for a civil engineer is currently £35,000, which is higher than 25,600. So 35,000 is going to be the minimum salary for that role. My view still remains that the reduced salary of 25,600 is not really significant enough to compensate for the lower salary. I don't know if coming out of A-levels at 18, you're likely to walk straight into a role at 25,600. Arguably not, but there are going to be some tradable characteristics such as new entrant route to allow for a reduced salary. So we'll talk about those in more detail in a minute. There's also going to be a change with regards to guaranteed annual allowances. Now, under the current scheme, sponsors could take into account guaranteed annual allowances, bonuses, benefits for that migrant to reach the minimum salary threshold. However, under the new scheme, only guaranteed gross basic salary will count towards that minimum threshold. And so, importantly, existing sponsors need to be aware that there will be transitional arrangements in place for those Tier 2 general migrants who've relied on, for instance, guaranteed benefits or guaranteed allowances in their current application and may be looking to extend their visa under the new system next year and are now really worried because they're not going to hit the requirements. But there are going to be transitional arrangements in place for those individuals. And I think generally it's just going to be quite a big relief for employers that those individuals they won't lose. Suspended cap, we've obviously come on to mention this slightly already, but presently the government controls restricted certificates. Those are migrants that are entering from outside of the UK to work through a monthly allocation system. I'm not going to go into that monthly allocation system because that's essentially what is being removed under this new system. But for those that are listening that are existing sponsors, I'm sure you'll be thrilled that that monthly allocation system will no longer be, no longer be in place. And there is a cap at the moment on how many of those certificates can be granted each month. And the total annual cap is currently 20,700. But that annual cap is being suspended under the new system. And as I've mentioned already, the terminology is quite important there. It's not being deleted or removed, it's being suspended. So the government does have the ability to keep that under review in case migration numbers start to peak again and they want to tighten their reins. But initially, it's great news for sponsors as there's no theoretical limit on the number of hires they can make from outside the EU. From outside the UK. That's just a habit, isn't it, saying the EU? From outside the UK from January. And it also removes a 4-week process, essentially, because they're not having to go through that monthly allocation. So all good news. Also, as we've already mentioned, the resident labour market test has been abolished. Another real positive for sponsors because it's very much a definitive call, I would say, that we're not going to see this coming back into place. And it does remove another 4-week kind of recruitment process that a sponsor would normally have to adhere to, because for those that aren't currently a sponsor, the resident labour market test expects a minimum of 28 days for a job advert to be advertised in certain specified places. And so sponsors are going to have a lot more flexibility going forward. I'd say my top tip here is don't be under the illusion that a recruitment process is no longer required at all. Sponsors are still going to have to show that that role is genuine and the applicant is sufficiently skilled. And the best way to do that is through the CV and through the recruitment process. And so whilst it won't be as prescriptive and can be based on, a sponsor's own approach to how they deal with recruitment and where they would normally put an advertisement and what they would put in that advertisement, sponsors will still need to evidence some form of recruitment process has taken place. We're expecting more guidance on this in the updated guidance once it's released. But today, I just think it's important that it means that there is still some type of recruitment process, but it will be a lot more flexible. There's also no cooling off period going forward. So applicants are currently subject to a cooling off period whereby Tier 2 visa holders cannot apply for another Tier 2 visa for at least 12 months from the date when they leave the UK. Under the new system, that cooling off period is being removed completely. So it should apply to existing Tier 2 migrants as well as new migrants under the skilled worker route. This is really great news for sponsors as they have much more flexibility when recruiting. And is also great for migrants. If they have to leave the UK, they can come back quite quickly if they get another job somewhere else. Then there's the removal of the 6-year maximum stay. Currently, Tier 2 general migrants could stay in the UK for a maximum of 6 years under this route. And of course, after 5 years continuous residence, they can apply for indefinite leave to remain, but they couldn't keep extending that Tier 2 leave. Under the new system, the 6-year maximum period is being removed completely. So that just completely adds to the flexibility for both migrants and sponsors that under the skilled worker route, you can keep extending that indefinitely. There's no cap going forward. And then switching. Whilst it's last on my list, I think this change is certainly not to be forgotten or not to be taken into account. I think one of the most frustrating rules at the present moment is the inability for migrants to not be able to switch in country when they're looking at, changing visas. the amount of times I'm advising, yes, absolutely, you can hire that person, but they'll have to go back to their home country to apply. I'm really looking forward to not having to say that anymore, hopefully, in most of the situations, because there will be the ability for migrants to switch their visas in country, and that will give migrants and sponsors a lot more flexibility. So that's a really positive change. So let's have a little look at what is required then under the skilled worker route. So an applicant is going to need 70 points to have their visa approved, and 50 of those points are going to be mandatory. And so if the following 50 points are not satisfied, the visa application will automatically fail. So those 50 points can be gathered from a job offer from a licensed sponsor with a certificate of sponsorship that's already assigned. That will then get the applicant 20 points. And one of the things I have picked up from the new rules is that going forward, a certificate of sponsorship that you're assigning must now include details of the sponsor's PAYE details. That's not something that's currently in situ, so that's coming in as well. So that's just something to be mindful of, mainly for existing sponsors. The second criteria is that job must be at or above the minimum skill level, which we've already discussed is identified as at the RQF level 3 or A-level equivalent, and that will get you your 20 points. And then thirdly, the applicant must speak an acceptable level of English language up to level 1B. There's no difference, that was currently still the case, and that will get you 10 points. If you've got all three of those criteria, you'll get your 50 points. My top tip here is just not to forget, especially for kind of any new sponsors that are thinking of getting a license, that there will be a criminality check at the outset, which migrants must pass as well. But essentially, it's those 50 points that you're looking at in terms of mandatory criteria. And then you come on to say, well, how do you make up the remaining 20 points, Gemma? So the easiest way will be for an applicant that has a salary of at least 25,600 or the going rate, whichever is higher, to then be allocated their 20 points, which reaches their 70 points, and that's a relatively straightforward hire. The more complicated scenario is when you get into the tradable points. So where an applicant earns less than 25,600, but more than 20,480, the applicant can earn tradable points if they have a job offer in a specific shortage, as recommended by the Migration Advisory Committee, or a PhD qualification relevant to the job. There are also different minimum salary requirements for workers in certain health or education jobs and for new entrants at the start of their career. And the salary requirement for new entrants, so this is somebody below the age of 26, will be 30% lower than the rate for an experienced worker in any occupation. However, the minimum salary must always be met, which is 20,480. Now you're probably saying to me, oh gosh, Gemma, what on earth does this mean? So in terms of visual learning, I'm quite somebody who does a lot of visual learning. So I thought it would be helpful just to put in some tables. So the summary tables show you the different options and the routes that allow an applicant to earn the 20 points. And an applicant can only score one entry from each of the two tables shown. So let's put this into perspective and have a little look at an example. So Richard is offered a job as a mechanical engineer for a salary of 26,750. He meets all of the mandatory criteria under the points-based system, scoring his 50 points. Although Richard's salary is higher than the general salary threshold of 25,600, it is below the going rate for mechanical engineers, which is 33,400. Richard's salary is just above 80% of the going rate for his occupation, which will not score him any points. So how can he make up the additional 20 points? Well, let's go back and have a look at our table. So if we go back and have a look at our table, you can see that although Richard's salary at 80% will not earn any points at all on the left-hand side, the actual job role of a mechanical engineer is something that's currently on the shortage occupation list. And as so, on the right-hand side, you can see that a job under a shortage occupation will gain him 20 points. He's also getting a salary of at least 20,480, and therefore he can gain his 20 points through being on the shortage list. If I'm honest, this is probably one of the easiest types of examples I can give, and I could go through so many with you as to how it could work. I think the easiest thing to say is that when you're looking at the tradable points and the 20 points, if you're confused or you're thinking, I don't quite know which table and which points and where I'm going with it, then obviously just drop us a line and we can assist you. So moving on now to the intracompany transfer route. This is the one that's replacing the Tier 2 ICT. And as I've mentioned before, it's intended to be used by established employees who are being transferred by their company to do a skilled role or sometimes a graduate training programme in the UK from that link company. In truth, as I've mentioned, there are really some minimal changes really. So for those that aren't really too familiar with this route already, there are no changes to the following. So there's still going to be no requirement for an English language in this route. There's still going to be a need for a link by an overseas company of having that individual been employed with them for more than 12 months, unless they're a high earner. There's still going to be the requirement that the job role that they're coming over to in the UK is at least at an RQF level 6, so a degree level. That's not being reduced like the skilled worker. And there's still going to be an expectation that their salary is at least 41,500 per annum, or the going rate, whichever is higher. And there's still going to be no route to settlement through this route. But the main changes are going to be that there's going to be this higher earnings threshold reduction. So a high earner will no longer be someone who's earning over 120,000. It will be somebody who's earning over 73,900 a year. And migrants will no longer be barred from re-entering the UK for 12 months after departing. Instead, they will be allowed more flexibility to hold the ICT visa for up to 5 years in any 6-year rolling period, or up to 9 years in any 10-year rolling period for high earners. ICT migrants will also be able to switch into the skilled worker route from within the UK if they want to settle. So I've seen quite a lot of discussions at the moment of existing intercompany transfer migrants that are here under that route and are thinking of switching into the skilled worker route going forward in order to then be able to settle in the UK. So the advantages of this route are quite minimal, if I'm honest now. The only real advantage is there's just no English language requirement. The disadvantages are that the salary level is still going to be a lot higher than the skilled worker route. The skill level is still going to be a lot higher than the skilled worker route, and there is no right to settlement. So I think really the reality is that this route is going to be used less and less over time. The Migration Advisory Committee are currently doing a review for the government on this route, but I think it is something we're going to see phased out quite a lot. And the skilled worker route is going to be where the most of the visas are going to be. My next top tip is that sponsors appropriately budget for these new hires coming in and out of the UK. And I pondered with myself as to whether to include this, but I think it's actually really important. And so the cost of such hires are not insignificant at all. And when you start adding them up, I think they really need to be something that's at the forefront of the business's mind when they're looking at recruitment. So I've listed on the slide the different types of costs, and I'll just talk through them just very briefly. So the immigration skills charge, for those of you that aren't an existing sponsor already and are thinking of becoming a sponsor, this is essentially a government plug to get some more money for each hire that is brought in from outside of the UK going forward. So it's £364 if you're a small business, which means you've got a turnover of 10.2 million or less, or have 50 employees or less, or you're a charity. Otherwise, it will be £1,000 for any medium or large sponsor for every year of the migrant's visa term, and that is something the employer must pay. Then the additional cost of the NHS surcharge, that's recently just gone up to £624 every year for migrants, but there are some reduced fees, for instance, those that maybe are students or youth mobility visas, and often the employer will reimburse a migrant for that cost. Then you have a certificate of sponsorship fee, which is £199, and that is paid for by the employer. And then you have visa fees. Now, visa fees vary quite a lot, but based on us talking about the skilled worker and the intracompany transfer route, a 3-year visa is going to be £610. And if you were looking to hire a migrant under a 5-year visa, it's £1,220. And then, of course, if they have any dependents with them, that obviously needs to be factored in as well. And often my experience is that employers do reimburse migrants for their visa fees. So I've added a calculation really to the bottom of the slide just to put it into a complete perspective about how much a 3-year visa would cost a sponsor if they were to pay for all of those associated costs above. And so a 3-year visa cost is going to cost £5,681 for a medium or large business, or down to £3,773 for a small organisation. But if you are a sponsor that you've been relying mostly on having no sponsorship license to this point, seeing, EU free movement and having a lot of EU workforce. This is something that really needs to be factored in to your kind of, business strategy going forward. So moving on to the sponsorship license. As already noted in the Q&A section at the start, existing sponsors don't have to do anything with their sponsorship licenses. They are going to be automatically converted across. As I mentioned in the Q&A, my top tip here for existing sponsors is to check their unrestricted certificates that they currently have available on their system, because if they don't have any and they're thinking of maybe hiring between January and April, they're going to need to ask for an in-year request. And then they're also going to need to justify where they may need an increase in their annual allocation from April 2021. So I think workforce planning there is going to be important. I was really surprised to hear a statistic actually last week that the UKVI have only seen a 3% increase in applications for sponsorship licenses. The UKVI were expecting a surge in applications, and I think probably due to the pandemic and the uncertain times is why sponsors are holding off. But certainly I think the amount of sponsorship licenses that are going in and the applications are not at the moment what the government were expecting, but time will tell if this increases. So what is a sponsorship license exactly? So a sponsorship license is the tool to allow the employers to hire skilled nationals from outside the UK from January 2021. The UK reiterates that holding this license is a privilege and not a right, and I think that's really important to stress. There are lots of sponsorship duties and responsibilities that need to be maintained throughout the license. It really is quite a big responsibility, and I think, it's important that when you are looking at that application and gathering those supporting documents, you understand what those duties and obligations are on you. Because obviously if you don't adhere to them and you potentially get your license revoked or suspended, this could really impact on your business going forward. It's important to stress here that also that the UKVI can make an unannounced visit at any time once your application has been submitted. And before, I have seen the UKVI, probably not in pandemic times, but hop on that quite quickly and get straight to an organisation that has just put an application in, and they weren't expecting it and they didn't have their systems in place like they said they did, and their license got refused. So I think it's really important that a top tip here is that as soon as you press that button to say, let's submit that application, you have all your ducks in a row and you're completely ready for a visit if they come. If the license is granted, it will be granted for 4 years, which is then able to be renewed. And businesses will put themselves on the back foot in terms of accessing talent if you don't have that sponsorship license available. So it's definitely something that you need to be thinking about. So how do you apply? Businesses apply online. There's a very short form to complete. And as Karen mentioned earlier, most of the preparation time is the evidence gathering, which has to be submitted with the application. Usually evidence must be originals or certified copies. However, during the pandemic, the UKVI is allowing employers to email the evidence across with the application. This is something they've never allowed before. And so I think at the moment, it probably is slightly easier for sponsors to prepare and get that application in whilst the pandemic's ongoing, and how long that kind of temporary adjustment will be in place, I don't know. But at the moment, it is looking like it's slightly easier. And what are my top tips on applying? Well, I've probably got 3, I would say. The first one is ensuring you have the correct documents available. This will differ depending on what type of organisation you are, but for those that are looking, Appendix A is where you need to start looking. My second top tip is identifying the correct key personnel. I think individuals who are ready and prepared to take responsibility for their role and the sponsorship of migrants will be important, because there are a lot of them. You're going to have specific obligations on record keeping, you're going to have specific obligations on reporting and compliance and right to work checks, and it's important that that person is ready and prepared to do that. And then my last top tip really is workforce planning. So having an idea of what vacancies you are likely to be wanting to fill throughout the course of next year, so that your certificates can be allocated to your sponsorship management in preparation for those vacancies. How long does it take? As I've mentioned already, it takes about 8 to 10 weeks from submission, but the priority service, as mentioned, has just come in, allowing an extra £500 to be paid for, so that you can get a decision potentially within 5 working days, but we're waiting to see. So what are the alternatives? And I thought I'd just do another slide for this because there are quite a few that I just wanted to just quickly briefly mention. So the first 4 options on the slide are already available, and I'll just talk you through them. And then the last 2 options are going to be new routes from 2021. So the visitor route, this is for someone who wants to come to visit the UK for up to 6 months, but they can't work. They can perform permitted business activities outside of the scope of this webinar, but if you would like more information, obviously do get in touch. I think the main point to note here is that I'm hearing decision making is going to be tougher at the borders on visitors. And so my top tip here is that evidence of the permitted business activity is going to be even more crucial. And so letters from the organisation saying this is what the permitted activities are going to be on this date at this time will be even more crucial to have at entry at the border. The global talent route, this is something already available, and it's where a recognised body endorses the applicant based on their exceptional promise or talent. And it really is very much exceptional promise or talent. They are absolutely top of the talent pool. It's very document heavy in terms of the application, and it's very hard to get approved. I'm not going to deny it. Having a conversation with one of the main endorsing bodies recently, Tech Nation, they refuse up to 50% of the applications they receive. So whilst it's an option that I'm mentioning and it allows no sponsorship, it's not an easy one, but it's something to be mindful of. There's the youth mobility route. So this allows a person aged between 18 to 30 from certain countries such as Australia, Canada, Japan to work and live in the UK for up to 2 years. It's essentially to experience the UK culture, and there are no fundamental changes to this route. The one major thing to be aware of, though, is that migrants are going to be allowed to switch into this route, from this route into the skilled worker route from the 1st of December without having to leave the UK. And I think the amount of clients we have that have hires that are youth mobility between 18 and 30 here for 2 years and then getting on really well in their job and then having to go home to their home country to then come across and back and apply under the tier 2 route. They just won't have that anymore. You'll be able to switch and not have that period of time where you don't have that role filled. That's going to be a huge benefit. There's the family visa, so the applicant relies then on their connection or family ties to obtain the right to work, which is obviously another option. And then there's the 2 new routes that are coming in that are new. So from the summer of 2021, the graduate route is going to be introduced. Me and Karen have already touched on this, but there will be no sponsorship required, and successful applicants will be granted a one-time, non-extendable 2-year visa, and that will be 3 years for PhD students. And it will really allow employers and employees to engage graduates easily, and then they can switch into the skilled worker route if after the 2-year period it's gone really well. So that will be a huge advantage for graduates and sponsors. And then the last route that's new is the Hong Kong British National Overseas route. That's going to be launched at the end of January, and will allow those who are ordinarily resident in Hong Kong or the UK, along with their dependents or a household member, to apply. And they will be allowed to work and study, and that will be granted for a 2.5 or 5 year period. So lastly, just coming on to now some questions that we had submitted in advance that I don't feel like I've covered properly when I had a look at the list. So I thought I'd just quickly cover them so that we had covered every basis. So the first question is, what is the definition of a new entrant under the skilled worker route? So a new entrant is one of the tradable points under the skilled worker route, and a new entrant is someone who is very much in the early stages of their career. They are entitled to come to the UK on a lower salary than their more experienced counterparts, and they are going to be entitled to a 30% discount on the going rate, subject to the lower salary threshold of 20,480. Now, whilst as the current rules state, a new entrant can be those that are under 26 on the date of the application or are switching from the student or graduate route, one of the new requirements is going to be that a new entrant can be somebody working towards a recognised professional qualification or moving into a postdoctoral position. And so that is something just to be mindful of. Second question is the shorted occupation list being updated based on the MAC's recent recommendations? Well, frustratingly, it's not going to be updated at the present time. Controversially for sponsors, I think the government has decided not to implement any of the MAC's suggested changes to the shortage list. I know when I was reading it, I got really excited. There are over like 70 new occupations that are mainly based at the more A-level, occupation that have suggested to be added. And I thought this is really going to give so many of our clients, so much flexibility to hit those additional 20 points. But no, the government's rationale is that they're going to hold off on updating the shortage occupation list, so that they can really assess how the labour market develops post-COVID and the introduction of the new system. So at the present time, we don't know when that shortage list has been updated, but it only has degree level equivalent occupations on it at present. And then the last question is, if employees are entitled to settlement status under the EUSS, but don't apply for it by the 30th of June, do they lose their right to work in the UK, and would an employer be liable to penalties for continuing to employ them? The answer to that question is yes, right to work in the UK will be lost, and an employer would be liable for civil and criminal penalties for continuing to employ them after the 30th of June, unless there are reasonable grounds as to why that deadline was missed. Now, as I mentioned, there are further guidance awaited on what the definition of reasonable grounds is, so watch this space. But, seeking for employees to volunteer their EUSS status decisions in advance of the 30th of June is certainly an option, as long as there's no pressure or expectation, as I've mentioned, placed on that employee to do so. So that really concludes our webinar today, and hopefully gives you a bit of a better understanding of what the new system entails.
Thank you, Gemma. I hope you've all found that really helpful. As I said at the beginning, the purpose is to bring you up to date and to give you the tools that you need to now think about this. I think from our perspective, certainly one of the things that we see from clients is really that responsibility towards applicants and existing employees to support them. And so I think particularly around EU workers and so on, there's probably still some people who have not got to grips with these changes. So the more that we can do as businesses to help people understand, the better. Some good news there for current sponsor license holders, which is unusual to get some good news on the business immigration front. So really hoping that starts to make life a bit easier. But as with any changes, there's quite a bit to work through and understand. So do let us know if you've got any business immigration queries. We can help with them. We can also help individuals who might have queries about their own immigration status, family visas, spouse visas, all that sort of thing. So the best place to get in contact with us, you've got our details there. If you have a fatality contacting the employment team that you usually deal with, you can absolutely just drop a line to them and they will make sure that the query comes to Gemma or to me, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.